evening, Grace America. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio West. Breaking headline, former Senator Bob Menendez has been sentenced to 11 years in prison in the Gold Bars case. Talk about that and many other things. Victor Davis Hanson returns, eminent military historian and classicist, old friend of the program. It is good to see you again, Victor. How are you?
Very good. Same here, Hugh. Good to see you.
What do you make of the sentencing of Menendez and the message that Americans are going to take away from that?
I think he pressed his luck one too many times. He skirted the law, as you know, and he's been in trouble for years. And I think their attitude's going to be just desserts, and they hope it serves as a deterrent for people like him.
I agree. Now, Philip Klein of National Review wrote a column today about the brokenness of elites, that a lot of the pro-Trump movement, and it's growing, he's at 57 or higher percent approval right now, is because Americans center-right, and conservative have concluded the government's just broken at every level, and it's corrupt at many levels. Do you think that in part explains Trump's triumph in 2024?
Yeah, I do. Part of it was the empathy for what he went through, and that was a symptom of the corruption. The lawfare, five jurisdictions, 91 pseudo felony counts, trying to get him off the ballot in 16 states, impeaching him twice, trying him as a private citizen, all of that. People just thought, these people are obsessed and they're using the government to go after someone who, if he just said he wasn't going to run for president, they wouldn't have done it. And they wouldn't ever use those same indictments against anybody else. They were sort of suspect. And then, of course, it was the weakness of Kamala Harris, Joe Biden. Those were two of the worst candidates we've seen. So he was a beneficiary of that. But what they did to him, boomerang, put it that way. People got sick
mildly.
of it.
Oh, now,
Yeah.
I was just talking with Mary Catherine Ham. I want to ask you, the infirmity of Joe Biden was well known, but his mental incapacity was not understood to be as significant as it was. It's a scandal of incredible size. Is there any way to investigate it, given the president's constitutional authority and separation of his branch from the Congress?
I don't know, but a lot of people have wondered about that because there were, of course, executive orders he signed, bills he signed into law that seemed, in retrospect, to have been made when he was non compos mentis, and yet people who knowingly knew that, and yet they conspired to disguise that fact. And the locus classicus of that, of course, was when Speaker Johnson said that he talked to the president himself and said, "Why did you delay or put on hold these LNG terminals in Louisiana?" And he said, "I have no memory of it. I didn't know I did it." And that does suggest some type of fraud. If anybody wanted to investigate that further, that the president of the United States says he signed a bill of which he had no idea that he had done that, and yet it had enormous importance.
There are 8,500 commutations and pardons which occurred in the last 3 months when his incompetence is at its most severe, however severe that might have been. Some of those are just genuinely shocking. He pardoned or commuted, actually, the sentence of a murderer who killed a witness and her child in a drug trafficking case. And that's just the one that stuns most people. We can't revoke that. The pardon power and the commutation power is absolutes in the Constitution, black letter law. But should we investigate it? And if so, do you think Congress has a constitutional ability to do so?
Well, I think they do. Even with the 1,500 that Trump pardoned, if you look at the last 5 presidencies, Joe Biden pardoned more than all 5 combined. And with the 2,000 from Bill Clinton, which was until then the high in the modern period, they pardoned over 10,000 people, Clinton and then Biden. And even with Donald Trump, as I said, he and George Bush had about 2,000. So there was a great asymmetry, and it seems to be more of a Democratic phenomenon, at least in the modern period. And I think they're going to have to check. I don't know what the constitutionality of it, you know better than that as a legal mind, but it seems to me that it's been abused. It's got to stop.
I agree, and I don't know how to do it, though. Sometimes it's okay to say, I just don't know. Now, Victor Davis Hanson, when you were a young professor, I was a young lawyer in the federal government. and I ended up running OPM because everybody else left in the Reagan years. And so I know a lot about the Federal Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, but it's been more than 30 years. I don't have any problem with Donald Trump firing 12 lawyers who tried to prosecute him. They ought to have quit before they went to work for Jack Smith because his appointment was unconstitutional. What do you think ought to be? I don't know what the rules are now because rules and laws change, but what do you think ought to be the rule concerning the 2 million federal employees in the executive branch?
Well, there has to be some that are civil service, but they have abused that because it is a phenomenon that when Barack Obama came in, he fired vast numbers of people. And I can say from personal experiences, I was a non-political appointee on, of all commissions, the American Battlefield Monuments Commission.
Oh, that's the best commission.
That's the best commission. It is. And my job was to be a custodian of our dead overseas, 50% of which of all dead in our wars are buried there. And I never billed it. I would go on a tour, I'd go on a trip, and I would always go visit these and talk with the custodians there. I never even billed the government. And yet when Barack Obama came in, I got a letter saying you will surrender your diplomatic passport, your commission immediately within 10 days. And then he left it open for almost a year until he appointed Max Cleland. My point is that Donald Trump is bringing us back to normalcy, but because we have been accustomed to what the left has done, it seems like suddenly they feel, well, you're supposed to play by the Marquess of Queensberry rules and we can do whatever you want. You're not supposed to do what we do. And yet when you try to correct what they do, you consider a radical because they were so off the scale. Same thing with the border. They're talking about the cost of deporting people, but what was the cost of letting 12 million people in and the havoc they wrecked? So a lot of this is all connected, and I think people have to take a deep breath and say, you know what, it's going to be costly to undo the damage and the precedents that they inspired and established. I think a lot of it is anger that they realize now that they did certain things with the executive orders, with the border, that they never thought would be used by a president to enact policies that had public support. They abused the system because they didn't have public support. But Donald Trump is saying, well, since you established these precedents, I'm going to use it to do things that people want. And now they're going crazy and they feel that they empowered Trump in a way they never thought possible. They thought he was going to be like George Bush or Romney or McCain or Bob Dole, and they didn't understand that he's a different sort of person.
Now, Victor Davis Hanson, this is a question. We're going to go into the break and then bring you back as well and talk during the break. It's a big question. It's a theoretical one. The civil service dates to the late 1800s. The Pendleton Act. Teddy Roosevelt, I think, was the first civil service commissioner, and now it's 2 million people. And you can barely budget. And you cannot move the federal civil service but an inch at a time. And I ran it for 3 years. I know what I'm talking about. I know the laws are complex. But the Congress can, as part of the Budget Act, say, notwithstanding any other law, including the Federal Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, the president shall have the authority to reduce the federal employment ranks by 20%. It can do that. No questions asked. Anybody he wants. Should the Congress do something like that?
Absolutely. I wrote a book called The Dying Citizen. I had a chapter called The Unelected. And they are judge, jury, and executioner on these. And many of these bureaus, especially the EPA people, they interpret and use and exercise the law in a way that the framers of that law never intended. That's what's really disturbing. They become evolutionaries. They take a law and then they think, well, all of the elected officials are transitory and we know the law better than they do. And they're going to come and go. We're here permanently and we're going to go after somebody and they'll have enormous legal expenses, even if we're in the wrong. They're not accountable. So I feel that part of that's because of the size and the arrogance and the compensation. So anything that can reduce the size and the nature of the government, permanent government, I think is salutary.
And do we want more political appointees who have set terms? You come in with a president and you leave with a president?
I kind of like the idea of amateurism. amateurism, because I think a lot of these people master the arcane nature of their offices, and then they just have contempt for elected officials who are their overseers, because they think they don't know as much, and they don't know as much because they have taken the legislation and expanded at such a great degree that the lawmakers never even knew what they were, basically what would be the result of their passing this law. My famous, very quickly, is the Inland Waters Way. They come into California on a farm and they say this pond that filled up after a rain is an inland waterway. And so they do things
let's
like
talk
that.
about that during the break. I'll be right back. The Clean Water Act and the 404 regulations pursuant, Section 404 regulations pursuant to that act are absurd. Absurd. Victor Davis Hanson is back, and I'm so happy. Stay tuned. I'm back with Victor Davis Hanson. Victor, the fires in Los Angeles were terrible. And I agree for the people who lost everything and the loss of life. It is a monument to government incompetence. The fire hydrants did not work. There's no getting around that. Now, Donald Trump knows the Delta smelt and the Chinook salmon are screwing up water supplies to the Central Valley, and those are two different issues. But in a way, it's all about the California dysfunction. I think the president is right to lump it all together. Do you?
Absolutely. And the California Water Project and the Central Valley Project, the federal and state, they were designed to send water to 1/3 of the state, and from the area where 2/3 of the precipitation falls. And Gavin Newsom told a great untruth when he said the reservoirs are full. What he meant was they're 60% full because we anticipate a big snowmelt. And that's where we are at this time of the year. But we're not anticipating a big snowmelt. We're in a drought condition, so they could be much fuller. And it was a systems breakdown, from timber management to driving out the insurance industry by prescribing how much they could charge, which was unrealistic. They were losing $1.50 for every dollar in premium. And then you had the mayor, not only in Uganda, we had the deputy mayor that she appointed basically under veritable house arrest for phoning in a bomb threat to the city council, allegedly. And then we had, of course, Miss Quiones, who came from a checkered career at PG&E, and she didn't have any idea that the reservoir was still 117 million gallons. It was not full because of a minor tear in the cover. It was just a complete systems breakdown, and it was partly the green obsessions here, partly the anti-modernism of the whole state. They feel they want to go back in the 19th century, and partly it was the DEI, and they all know that. And everybody knows it, and the people who voted for it know it. And just the $64,000 question is, are people just angry and blowing off steam, or does this a fundamental shift in the way that they look at politics and they won't elect these people? But I'm not.
Well, when the president
confident.
brought up changing the voting rules in California, he's actually getting to the root of the problem, which is it is legal to harvest votes. The SEIU is very good at it. The Republicans are not so good at it. There's a machine, the California Teachers Association, the prison guards, the tribes, they run the machine. You've got to change the basic rules to change the machine. But my God, not since Pete Wilson have we had a competent governor. It's been that long. Arnold wasn't competent.
No, it wasn't. And we're on the fume. We're basically living on the fumes, and they're very scant now, but of 24 years of Ronald Reagan, Pete Wilson, and earlier George Mason. They were all good governors. They really created the infrastructure that we've abused. And I don't know, we had 3 congressional seats, Steele, and here in the San Joaquin Valley, Duarte and Garcia, or he was near Tehachapi. They all won on election day. Yeah, everybody knew he was Lancaster area. Everybody knew that they were great congresspeople. They were essential to the Republican majority. If they were in there right now, we wouldn't have a lot of these problems.
Agreed.
And yet, on election day, we all said, how much did they win by? I hope they won by 4 or 5%, because we know the SEIU mail-in
I got to come
ballots,
back on air,
Victor.
enough. Stand by.
Yeah.
Stand by. Welcome back, America. During the break, Professor Victor Davis Hanson and I were talking about the breakdown in California elections. He pointed out that 3 Republican congressmen, incumbents, Garcia, Michelle Steele, Michael Garcia, Michelle Steele, and Duarte in the Central Valley, all were leading by a lot. But they ended up losing because votes show up 3 days after the election, but they're postmarked on the day of election. Other votes are cured. It's actually kind of legal to cheat in an old-fashioned way in California. And Victor, I don't think you can fix the state. I'm no longer a Californian. It's not my problem. I'm a Virginian who comes out here to teach every other year. What do you think? Can this state be fixed?
Well, not unless they change. The only hope that I have is the Hispanic population, which is largely Mexican American, flip 5 counties, including my own, Fresno County. And they are starting to see that they cannot afford, as an aspiring middle class population that's coming into its own. They cannot afford the gas, they cannot afford the electricity prices, they cannot afford the crime, the poor infrastructure, and the poor schools. And they're starting to rebel. And I don't know how long or how big that rebellion, but that will help. And then the fire was the real first time that a whole constituency suffered the consequences of their ideology. Usually they're exempt because of their zip code or their money or their influence. Not this time. And they are still angry at Gavin Newsom. So maybe we've got to peak woke, peak Green New Deal, peak all of this craziness. And California will become a two-party system. I mean, we have super majorities of Democrats. We only have, I think it's 9 congressional seats of 52, not one state officer. 14 out of 15 on the city council were Democrats. So it was a Democratic project, is what I'm trying to say. All of this
You're saying
disaster.
very well. And the Overton window of what they will do is move sharply to the left. Victor,
Yeah.
in terms of this is a scary thought. I had this conversation around our dining room table with a half dozen people who were dinner guests. What would happen if we actually had a significant earthquake in either southern or northern California? I mean, a 7.5, a Santa. What we saw what happened in the fires. Everything broke down. What do you think would happen in LA if there was actually the big one happen?
Oh, I'd be very scared. I mean, we had the Loma Linda, but we had a different governance. So they rushed into, they built the clover leaves and rebuilt it. It wouldn't happen. It would not. Because I'm saying that because I live 6 miles from what I call Stonehenge, and that is the overpasses on the high-speed rail from Bakersfield to Merced. It's been 15 years. My road was shut down for 6 years, and they've covered with graffiti $18 billion. It's going to be up to 150, and they haven't laid 1 foot of track yet. And it's a complete disaster. And when I see them work and I see the eminent domain and the law, it was a complete catastrophe. And that's how they're going to approach public works. And then finally, very quickly, we voted $7.5 billion to build reservoirs. Had we built the Sites Reservoir, the Los Banos Grandes, Temperance Flat, all easy, low elevation for flood years, 6 million acre feet of water. What did we do? We didn't build one, even though the voters voted. And he took $300 million, Newsom, and he blew up 4 dams on the Klamath River. That was adding insult to injury. 4 dams, 80,000 homes on clean hydroelectric power, recreation, flood control, irrigation, just blew them up.
I want the audience to know that before Victor Davis Hanson was one of the country's eminent military historians, one of their eminent classicists, he was and remains a farmer, and he's in the Central Valley. So Donald Trump comes out and says to Gavin Newsom, I'm not sending aid for anything till you fix the California Water Project and get water to the Central Valley. Now, we're talking to Fresno right now, and we're talking to Los Angeles right now. It's different from the fire hydrants not having water, but it's all part of the problem. Do you think Donald Trump can get this fixed? Because it's a nightmare. It's an absolute ridiculous injury to the American prosperity and dream to deny water to the Central Valley, the breadbasket of America, in order to save the Delta smelt, which is not a native species, or the Chinook salmon, which will do fine if they can't swim in the Delta like they'd like to. Do you think Trump will get it done?
Well, the Central Valley Project shares the Delta bypass and with the California State Project. So he has a 50% input. And he has mechanisms that he did it before. He had the pumps turned on. That whole Sacramento tributary system, it gets into the Delta. Then we never built the peripheral canal, so it has to be pumped back into the aqueduct. And then it's been tapped to, now it's San Jose lateral, then San Luis Obispo, then Santa Barbara, then it's pumped over into LA. And it's an increasingly small, they count on Colorado River, they count on Owens Valley, but they need the aqueduct in LA as well. But he just announced, he said everything was great. I'm not diverting water. He just announced that all farmers on the west side of the Central Valley will get 10% of their contracted
You
water.
mean Gavin Newsom?
Yes, that's what he said. 10% of what they have had contractual arrangements since 1962. 10%, and everybody said, "Well, what are you doing with the water?" He never says where the water is coming into the delta and how much is going out. He always says the reservoirs are full, when in fact we had a very wet October, November, and that they filled up naturally, and he's not added anything to them, and the water is, as we speak, going out to the delta. And we know that 35 municipal waste plants on the San Francisco Bay contribute a lot of deoxygenation that hurts the smelt, but mostly it's an invasive species, the striped bass. It eats them, they love them. And so they've never really told us why this little canary in the mine fish is dwindling, because really it's not about the delta smelt. It's about this romantic, hyper extremist green idea that there was once 1850 salmon and it was a beautiful California until these evil people came. And it's all a project of the coastal elite that has so much money that they feel that they never suffer the consequence. It's always people in Bakersfield or Fresno or Merced or the Inland Empire that deals with the catastrophes.
Or as you said, the rising middle class of Latinos, and they're mostly Mexican Americans, but there are lots of other varieties of Latino American, and they're getting crushed. Victor, I filled up my car yesterday because I have to drive back and forth to law school, and it was $85 because California costs much more than anybody else. I don't know how people in California make it. I really don't. And so last minute to you, Lonnie Chen lost by 1 million votes statewide, best Republican candidate we've run since Pete Wilson. Do you think anyone can actually win in this state in 2026 who isn't a left-wing Democrat?
Well, I think Kevin McCarthy, somebody like that from the Valley that had broad support and also if we had a charismatic Latino contractor, builder, I know so many of them that are so successful in private enterprise. If one of them stepped up, I think they could win. I think people do not want what we have now. It's a dysfunctional state. It's propped up by Silicon. And the other thing we didn't mention very quickly, is we don't know the role of this $9 trillion of market capitalization. So it seems like a lot of the Silicon Valley money thinks we can't do business here. We've got to look for an alternative. And we saw that in the presidential race.
Yeah, it's leaving. Yeah. Elon Musk is the canary in the coal mine. Victor Davis Hanson, it is great to see you again. Follow Victor online at VD Hanson on X and his podcast and read his books. So good to have you back. Victor Davis Hanson will be a regular on the afternoon edition of the Hugh Hewitt Show. Stay tuned.